Okay, today's session, for some reason it's not showing the slide title. I'm not sure what happened to the slide title, but the slide title should be Considerations for Migration, or Migration Considerations this morning. That's what the entire session will be about. I'm estimating about an hour to an hour and a half. I don't think we'll need that break that I mentioned on the screen, but if we do, we'll take it. Won't be a problem with taking a break. And as usual, I'll go through the interface, a little bit about the interface that we use for the sessions, which is the Go to Training interface. So it works pretty well. If you need to leave and rejoin, you can do that privately. No one will notice. I won't notice if you leave. We always record the sessions, so if you miss part of the session because of work duties or perhaps something comes up that you have to attend to, like a phone call, you can always come back and watch the recorded session later if you want to. I've been a little slow about getting those sessions posted. It's been taking me up until the afternoon sometimes of the next day. But I will get those recorded sessions posted two places, at least for right now. One place will be where you initially registered for the session in our training website, where we have our online our instructor-led training posted. There's a place there where we have all of these Training Tuesday sessions posted, and right there where the Register Now link is normally shown, you can actually click on that link later to view the recording of the session. And the other place is on our online video site. So we have a lot of good videos posted, and I've been including these Training Tuesday sessions with those posted online videos. If you need to reach me during the session, you can use the chat interface that's included with the Go to Training interface, but you can also reach me later by email. And if you notice, the slide down at the bottom here has my email address, lchildress@4jace.com. So you can always send me an email that way. I usually get back with you pretty quickly, within an hour or so. If it's something I have to look up or research, I'll usually let you know that too and get back with you when I've found the answer. Here's the interface. This is a small picture of the control panel for the interface. You can see the viewing area on the left. Over here is your viewing area where you'll see the slides or the screen if I'm actually demoing something from Internet Explorer or Genero Studio. And then over here on the right side shows you the actual control panel for the Go to Training interface. And I've got a better picture of that, so we'll take a look at it. Here's a blown up picture of the control panel so that you can see the different options. Here's the red arrow that you can use to open or close your control panel. You can close it while the session's going on so that it doesn't use so much screen real estate. There's a mute option here that shows the microphone. You won't actually have much control over that because I have you muted from here. So I think me having you muted overrides any options you have for unmuting yourself. So that won't be a problem. Here's the raised hand icon that I just mentioned a few minutes ago when we did the sound check. So if you have a question or need to let me know that there's a problem with the audio, that's one of your options, is to click on that raise hand icon, and that will get my attention so that you can send me a note, or I can turn on your speaking rights and you can ask me the question or tell me what's wrong. And of course, most of our communication seems to be using this chat interface down here at the bottom. I put a big yellow X in there, but that doesn't mean you can't use it. I was just trying to point it out. So that chat interface works pretty well. I get a little bubble that shows up that lets me know that somebody has sent me a question or has a comment. Most of the time, I suspect you're using voice over IP, you're using your computer speakers, but if you have a problem with those, there is a telephone option. If you look at the control panel over here on the left, if you toggle that to telephone, you should be able to see a telephone number that you can use to call in and listen that way. All right, so there's our introductory topics that we always go through before the session starts. So let's go ahead and take a look at migration considerations. This first slide is just more or less saying that you should prepare for a migration just as you would a normal new development project. There's going to be a few differences, of course, but for the most part you can treat it the same way with the same basic cycles of the project. For example, grab my highlighter here, analyzing your user requirements. You might be looking for something, for example, that might be missing with your current environment. Have we got something we'd like to go ahead and add to our current environment while we're going through this migration project? Is there anything we need to change about our current environment? That's the type of thing you might be looking at when you go through the first phase, the analyze user requirements. We'll talk more about that too on the next page. The second phase for a new project is typically to design the programs. Now in this case for a migration you might go at that phase a little differently too. Perhaps instead of worrying so much about the business logic like you would do for a normal development type project, maybe instead you're looking at things like new standards, perhaps things more to do with the redesign of the user interface for the second phase. Maybe looking at new standards for styles or action views, where you want to place things on the screen. Action defaults that you want to use. Trying to centralize a lot of these special attributes, things like styles, action defaults, and so on, so that when you actually enter the development or the coding phase of the project, the developers don't have as much work to do, right? You can centralize a lot of these things so it's less work and gives you also a lot more consistency in your user interface that way. The coding phase might also be a little different from a regular development project. It might be more a case of enhancing instead of actually coding the business logic. That might already pretty much be all in place. But you might be looking at coding to enhance the application. Maybe you don't want to enhance the application very much. Maybe you'd rather just kind of get something out there that's perhaps a little better than what you had before. But even so, there's likely to be at least some small changes required to transform your existing apps to something that looks more like a native web application. So perhaps the coding isn't so much concerned with business logic, but more coding that you would do to enhance what you already have. And in the document and test phase of the project, you would want to document your changes that you make to enhance your applications or add things to your application just like you normally document your code. And of course testing is important to make sure that your enhancements look like you expect or want them to look. So not much difference there between a regular development project and a migration project. And operate and maintain. The last phase of any project is just an ongoing phase, and it's no different here. Business being the way it is, there's always change in any kind of a business. We hope there's change, otherwise you're static and possibly risking going away. So anytime there's change, that means there's maintenance to do with applications, changes with applications, so that you can implement any changes that are coming down from up above as far as changes to your business. Also, maintenance can always involve troubleshooting bugs that you find in the code. Hopefully we have all those worked out, but I'm sure there'll be possibly some new ones due to any enhancements you make. It would be nice in an ideal world not to have to do that, but I don't think it happens very often. So there's the different phases of a project. So here we're looking more at analyzing the user requirements. In any project, whether it's a development project or a migration project, one of the first things you'll want to do is figure out what your requirements are. What are your reasons for wanting to move to a graphical environment? What do you hope to gain by moving to a graphical environment? What's the expected return on your investment in migrating? That's one of the first things you'd want to look at in detail. It's also important to do some planning that might include an analysis of your user requirements to find out if anything's missing. We talked about that a little bit on the previous page. What's missing from our current application, and what enhancements do we think will make it more successful in a more modern environment? Do we have a roadmap, or can we develop a roadmap on how to get there from here? Those are all things that you'll need to consider ahead of time. You'll also need to decide whether or not you want to migrate all your applications or perhaps just some of your applications. You might want to start out with, let's say, a small application or a prototype to see what's going to be involved. That would be a good starting point to help you decide whether to do a limited migration or a full migration from that prototype. There may be situations where you want to leave some applications pretty much as they already are. Just recompile them and run them with minimal changes. And in other applications, maybe some of the more prominent or critical applications that you want to really focus in on. Now, Genero has a couple of tools, I guess we could call them, to help you with that part. If you do decide, let's say, to leave some applications pretty much just as they are, you're not planning on enhancing them very much, you just want to recompile them with Genero and pretty much run them as they are. There's something called text mode that you can use just by essentially setting an environment variable. You can render your applications when they're compiled under Genero the same way that they looked with 4GL, right, with Informix 4GL. And they call that TUI mode or text mode. So that's one option you would have for some of the applications. Let's say you just want to recompile them under Genero and get them out there and available without any enhancements. Something else you might consider that would be, let's say, a step up from TUI mode or text mode would be to render the application in GUI mode. But one of the issues you might have if you don't want to go in and enhance the application or your form files for GUI mode would be that GUI mode by default uses something called proportional fonts, and it's intended for resizable windows where the user can resize the window, grab it and drag it to the size they like, that type of thing. And that does not translate very well to our traditional or legacy forms unless they've actually already been modified. So we have something called traditional GUI mode to address that problem. Traditionally, this traditional GUI mode has been used with the Genero desktop client, but they tell me that in 2.41, our next release of Genero, that you'll also be able to use this traditional GUI mode with the web client using HTML5. So that's a new enhancement that's coming out in our next release. So there's two options for applications that let's say that you really don't want to enhance per se. You want to just compile them under Genero and get them out there pretty much as they are. Text mode would be just kind of a flat one-on-one rendering of the application under Genero just like it looked with 4GL. All you have to do is set an environment variable for that. Traditional GUI mode would be pardon me, a step up from that. At least you would be rendering the application in GUI mode. It would be graphical, but it renders the windows as just simple boxes. You can definitely tell a difference between traditional GUI mode and, let's say, full GUI mode, where you have the resizable windows and the proportional fonts. Now, to use traditional GUI mode, there's also a change you have to make in an external configuration file called FGL profile, but it's a very simple change to make, very similar to just setting an environment variable, except it's an edit to a file. So there's a couple of options you can consider for, let's say, your less critical applications. The next step, or the next consideration, looks like front-end options. You need to do some analysis on who's going to be accessing the application and how you want them to access it. Are you going to be using a desktop? Or some users be using a browser, maybe a mixture of the two? If you're moving to a web environment, deployment's going to be a little different. You won't need to install a desktop client on every machine, but you'll need to plan for a web server working with your application server. So that'll be a different consideration for folks moving to a web environment. Your applications, though, can run on a variety of front ends. You can have some of your users using a desktop client, some of your users using the Genero web client, coming through using a browser. So those are things that you'll need to plan for and make sure you consider. Another consideration is changes in the roles of developers. When you start moving to a web environment, the way a lot of the customization is being done is outside of your standard 4GL development or even BDL development, using web technologies like JavaScript, HTML, CSS, and so on. So having someone in your group that understands web technologies or the technologies associated with customizing a browser-based interface and maybe has some experience of how a web-based application should look, how it interacts with the user, that can be very helpful. Now, there's no reason why someone already on your development team couldn't take on that role, but you can see where you'd need to do some preparation, some training ahead of time for that developer if they don't already have experience in that area. The UI designer roles, really important in a migration project. A lot of the success of a migration will hinge on how well the redesign of the user interface is done. So it would be nice to have someone on the development team that is able to focus on the user interface. Some of these standards we were talking about on the previous page, standardizing window styles, action defaults, how things are going to look on the screen. Down here at the bottom, something helpful in analyzing user requirements is to actually take the time to create what they're calling personas of existing like TUI environment users and then new users of your system. Some of your users, for example, might be very familiar with their old TUI-based applications, your old 4GL style rendering of the screen, and they might know all the shortcuts, all the command keys for doing things very quickly. So in a heavy-duty data entry environment, for example, you may not want to change those applications very much for certain users. Those are users with very specific user requirements. So you can see where developing personas for your existing user base can really be helpful so that your developers will all be on the same page when it's time to actually start developing applications, and they'll understand their target user base a little bit better. So that would be a good thing to do right up front to help you analyze user requirements. All right, let's see what we have. We talked about the front end on the previous page. Now they're focusing on the database. Something else to consider when you're migrating is databases. I know there's been cases that I've heard about with support where the main reason for a migration to Genero might be just to change the database. So database support is a key difference between 4GL and Genero BDL. Genero is database agnostic, and we use the native drivers with our Genero open database interface, and the same Genero program can open database connections to any of the supported databases. Informix, of course, Oracle, SQL Server, SQLite, any of the supported databases that we have adaptation guides for. Excuse me. I was talking to Lois a few minutes before we started, and the wind's blowing here in Texas today, so that's got my allergies stirred up a bit. So bear with me here while I try to get it straightened out. Excuse me. Okay. Now, I mentioned earlier that if you're planning on moving into the web environment with the web client, you'll need to plan for implementing a web server for deployment. So we support a lot of different types of web servers, Apache, IIS, Java. There's actually a GAS or Genero application server component that provides all these different connectors to support the different types of web servers. And we'll talk a little bit more about that a little later here in the session. Here's a few more considerations. I don't know that this one really belongs here in the user interface considerations, although it could for some things. But if you have custom C functions that you've been using with your legacy 4GL apps, you might consider swapping those out with some of our built-in classes and methods that we have in Genero. So it would be a good idea to review those C functions and see if there's some way you can swap those out without too much problem. For example, many moons ago, I was a 4GL programmer, and we used a C function to read from an external file. And now, if we were migrating that application to Genero, I would be able to replace that custom C function with a method from the channel class or methods from the channel class to read from external files. So there may very well be some classes and methods that you could use to swap out with those C functions. And that makes your application not only easier to read, but also makes it more portable. Right? Those C functions can cause some problems with portability when you're moving applications to different platforms that you won't have if you just use the compiled P code that Genero BDL uses. Check for open form and repeated display form statements. With 4GL, sometimes some of the 4GL programs do several open form statements at the beginning of a program so that when the program's running, all they have to do is display the form. And in whatever form is currently showing is replaced with the new form. And that, again, doesn't translate too well to a graphical environment. So one of the things you might want to do is go in and replace some of those open form, display form statements with the open window instruction, open window, window name with form, and in the name of the form. But Genero actually provides a default window named screen that you can use, let's say for the first instance of an open form, display form statement. That's really what it's designed to do, is to catch those open form display forms that you see a lot of times in legacy 4GL apps. So you can use that default window called screen for your first form that you want to display, and then for all your other forms you can replace those open form, display form statements with the open window instruction instead. Now you don't have to use the default window, the one called screen. You might have seen it. It's the window that pops up automatically and kind of gets tucked in sometimes behind your other windows. That's a default behavior just for migrated 4GL apps to try to give those forms somewhere to go when someone uses the open form display form statement. So you can use it or not use it, but if you decide to use your own named windows, you'll need to close the default window, and you can just use the close window screen instruction if you prefer not to use that default screen window. Something else to check for, kind of from the legacy text mode, is this display at instruction, where it's actually displaying text on the screen at certain screen coordinates. Now, a few minutes ago we talked about using TUI mode, right? Being able to use an environment variable to render your application using the old text mode or TUI mode. So that display at code is still supported if you choose to stick with your old text-based interfaces. And it's actually ignored if you absolutely don't want to touch the code. The display at is ignored in GUI mode if you're using layout in your form. Right, so you've gone into your forms and changed the screen section in the form to a layout section, it will actually ignore it in GUI mode. So there's a couple of things you can do. You can leave that display at code in there if you absolutely have to, but ideally it would be good to edit that out. User interface considerations. Here's some more considerations. They're recommending swapping out on-key and command instructions for the on-action statement. We've had a session, actually several sessions, where we talked about on-action, or we saw on-action in the code, so you should be fairly familiar with it by now. Not only does it make the code easier to read, it also helps separate the business logic from the presentation layer. So when we talked about separating out the roles a page or so ago, this would be a help for separating out the roles. That way you could have one person from the development group that's focusing on the presentation layer, how things are presented on the screen, in this case how actions are presented on the screen, and then you could have another developer that's just focusing on the business logic, what actually is going to happen when the user triggers that action. So that might be something to look at, swapping out those on-key and on-command statements for on-action statements. Another consideration, dynamic arrays. There wouldn't be a lot of modification to go in and change your static arrays to dynamic arrays in the code. And we did have a session where we discussed arrays in detail, and we learned that with dynamic arrays we get better memory management. With a static array, of course, we actually have to go out and allocate memory right up front when we define the array and specify the size. But with dynamic arrays, memory is actually allocated only when it's needed, right? Like when we add new elements to the array. So better memory management in addition to dynamic arrays not having a limit on the size. So they have theoretically unlimited size. So there's two basic benefits. But in addition to that, dynamic arrays are also used to implement some of the features we've looked at in our Training Tuesday sessions. Paged mode, for example, is implemented with dynamic arrays. If you remember, paged mode allows us to fetch data for the user a page at a time. So that reduces network traffic and, of course, also can save memory. If we don't actually need all those rows, we don't need to allocate memory up front for those rows, that extra data. So that can be very helpful for large data sets, paged mode. Something else, multiple row selection that we looked at in one of our sessions is also implemented with dynamic arrays. So that might be something that you'll want to consider when you're enhancing your applications. Dynamic arrays versus static arrays. Then down here, you might want to take a look at all of the forms that you're using or all the screens that you're using with your legacy 4GL apps and see if you can't rearrange things, redo some things to save on real estate and the number of screens that you have to maintain or the number of forms that you have to maintain. We have folders and folder tabs that can really be a big saver with large sets of data especially. The data is more or less kind of hidden in a folder page until it's actually accessed or triggered by the user to look at that folder page. The dynamic abstract user interface can save screen space because we can show and hide form objects as needed. So that's another way to save screen real estate. You might want to replace, let's say, some of those old vertical menus that took up most of the screen, maybe with top menus or toolbars or both, but either one would save a lot of screen real estate. Contextual menus that just show up when they're needed or when the user looks for them or asks for them. Widget possibilities would again be folder pages, for example, that you could use to save on real estate. You could also consider implementing table containers, right? Table containers would be widgets that have scroll bars, both vertical scroll bars and horizontal scroll bars that you can use to scroll to see the data. so it doesn't have to take up the entire screen. And finally, last here on real estate, they're talking about swapping out those old static screen arrays. With 4GL, if you wanted to display a list of records, you had to use a static screen array that had a finite number of lines. With Genero, you can still use the screen arrays if you're in the TUI mode that we talked about earlier. But if you're wanting to move to a more polished graphical or GUI application, you should use a table container, right? Swap those old static screen arrays out for table containers that are resizable, have the scroll bars. You might also look at scroll grid containers that have the vertical scroll bars. Both of those are maybe more efficient at preserving some of your screen real estate. The user can see all the data without it taking up the entire screen. Here's something that's very similar to the display at instruction that we saw a few pages ago. Here they're talking about opening a window and specifying coordinates on the screen, XY coordinates, to tell where to specifically display the window on the screen. And again, we still support that just like we support the display at instruction a few pages ago. But for GUI applications, if you want to move to the GUI world, you should replace that. So again, in TUI mode it's supported. It's even ignored in GUI mode. Again, if you've edited your forms to use the layout section instead of the screen section, it gets ignored. So you can still use it, but ideally it would be nice to edit those out. So down here's some recommendations for changing it. Here's open window using the at. So this is our old style 4GL. And then over here they're recommending just changing it out with the open window statement. All of that specifying coordinates on the screen isn't necessary with GUI applications. And more language instructions that are specific to character or ASCII terminals. So here we've got a different example this time of something that we've used traditionally. With the display array, you can actually use an attribute clause with 4GL to specify TTY attributes, in this case TTY attributes, but it had to use the scrolling capabilities of a terminal to be able to preserve those attributes for each row. And that's something that can't be supported anymore in the GUI world. So that's something that will need to be replaced if you move to a GUI mode. So that will need to be replaced. A recommendation for replacing it would be to use the set array attributes method. We actually covered the set array attributes method kind of coincidentally in one of our previous sessions. If you remember, to do that you need two arrays. One array, of course, would be your data array that actually has the program data that you're planning on displaying to the user, and then you would define an additional array that would be used for holding the TTY attributes that you wanted to assign to the array elements in the data array. It's kind of a mouthful, isn't it? So then you pass the attributes array to the dialog with this set array attributes method that we see here, and you just specify that or pass it to the dialog in a before input block if it's an input array instruction, or in a before display block if it's a display array instruction. And we actually saw an example of that in a previous session. So that might be a way to actually replace some of the attribute clauses that you might have with your legacy 4GL. We've actually already talked about the default screen window several slides ago, so I'll just remind you here that you're welcome to use the default screen window for your open form display form instructions that you have in your legacy apps. Typically what people do is maybe use the default screen window for the first, like the main window for the application, and in all the subsequent forms, then you can use the open window with form instruction is the typical rule of thumb. But if you're not going to use the default screen window, we talked about using the close window screen instruction to close it out so that it's not sitting there tucked up behind your other windows. Errors and messages. In TUI mode with your legacy applications, or if you use TUI mode when you migrate to Genero, error messages are displayed in the error line of a current window. In GUI mode, the error text is displayed in a specific area depending on the front end you're using. Traditionally, we use things like reverse video, maybe ring the terminal bell to get the user's attention. But when you migrate to GUI mode, you need to consider how you want the errors and messages displayed. There's special style attributes for both errors and messages that you can use that let you define, let's say, the output type and the text format for errors and messages. You might want, for example, to have errors displayed in a pop-up window, or maybe use bold font or the color red for an error message. Those are all things you can do in GUI mode. There's pseudo selectors. If you remember our session on styles that we had a few weeks back, there's special pseudo selectors for both errors and messages that you can add to your styles file. And you can also specify a style for messages and errors with the attributes clause. So those are some things you might want to consider as redesigning how you want errors and messages displayed. Same thing goes for whoops, had a hard time with a straight line here. Same thing goes with action attributes. We talked about actions and action defaults and how we can centralize our action defaults by centralizing them in a special XML file called, well, you can name it whatever you like, but it has an extension of .4ad. We talked about that in one of our sessions. So that's something that you'll want to look at for continuity's sake, making sure that your application has the same look and feel throughout. And it also, again, saves a lot of time if your individual developers don't have to worry about the standards you have and take the time to set a lot of attributes as they go along. Don't want the individual developer having to figure out what text to use for a button or what image he's supposed to use for exit, for example. And you can do all of that by centralizing some of those in a .4ad file. And styles. We've already talked about spending some time up front figuring out what styles you want to use for your standards. Perhaps a standard style you use for most of your windows, style for required fields or important fields, what colors you want to use, maybe a special color for background colors when a user is in a query mode, for example, things like that. So those are all things too. Perhaps you could dedicate a specific person to and centralizing action defaults and styles with one of these special external XML files, the 4AD file for action defaults and the .4st file for styles. Another place or another way you can centralize attributes is with the meta schema. Having a hard time pronouncing words too. We talked in, I believe it was the Studio session, when we did the tour of Studio, we talked a little bit about the requirements with Genero of using a special meta schema file. We don't do a lot of connecting to the actual database in development mode with Genero. Instead, we have you create a special meta schema file that has the database structure and can have a lot of the special database attributes, database column attributes stored in this special schema file, meta schema file, and we actually use that instead of doing a lot of connecting to the actual database. So we use that meta schema file Let me grab my highlighter real quick. This .4db metaschema file, we use that, for example, when you're defining form fields in a form definition file by referencing a database column, or if you're defining variables in the code with a like instruction, like a database column, we actually get the information about the database column from this .4db file. The .sch metaschema file is used for the actual compile of the application. So again, those are required, and once you've created these metaschema files or the metaschema file, you can enrich it with information that isn't in your actual database. The property view, you can see here in this screenshot, here we're in the DB Schema tab in Studio. Here's our schema viewing area here, and I can highlight, for example, a specific column in the database, and then I can edit that column's properties over here in the Properties pane. Notice some of the properties I can actually store here in the metaschema file. The default value for columns, the default label that I want it to use, default widget that I want to be used with that specific column. So those actually get pulled in as defaults into the form file. So that's another place where you can save some time and set up some centralized standards to reduce the amount of time that the developers have to go out and figure out what standards they're supposed to use and actually set all these attributes when they're creating, for example, a new form. Very handy. And a few more considerations. We haven't actually, whoops, missed the highlighter there. We haven't actually talked too much about the string data type. I think we did have a session where we were talking about some of the different classes and methods, and we actually looked at some of the methods that we have, the built-in methods specifically for strings. So one of the benefits to using strings is the fact that we have special classes and methods just for manipulating strings, which can save on code and save on time writing code to manipulate strings, let's say to parse a string, to create a string, get the length of a string. We have built-in methods for all of those things. So if you use a string instead of the normal char or varchar data type, you've got those special methods that you can use. Save some time there. In addition to that, the string data type does better with memory management than char data types or even varchar data types. So unlike those types of data types, strings actually allocate memory only as needed. Right? It only allocates memory for the actual characters you're storing. So along with the built-in classes and methods we have for string manipulation and management, we also have the memory management enhancements as well. Something else, there's some differences in localization or the use of localized strings with Genero from our legacy 4GL. If you're not familiar with localization, localization is used to allow you to, let's say, internationalize your applications for different languages that you may be supporting, or customize it maybe for site-specific text. For example, when business terms might be different between your different regions where you use the same application. So instead of having to actually have different copies of the application for different countries or different regions, you can use localization. So with localization, the idea is that you are more or less using a localized string as a placeholder anywhere where you would normally display some text that you might want to regionalize, let's say. And then at runtime, that localized string is actually replaced with some text that you have stored in a special compiled strings file. and you can use a different strings file for your different regions, for example, or your different countries when you run the application. So that's the idea. It kind of makes your application more portable in that sense. Don't have to have a whole separate copy of the application. You just have a different strings file, let's say. And then at runtime, depending on the strings file that you've specified, then it will pull in the appropriate text for the country or the region where you're using the application or that's using the application. So a few differences between the use of localized strings between Genero and 4GL is Genero doesn't use the Informix GLS library. GLS, if I remember right, stands for Global Language Support. I believe that's correct. And Genero, in order to be database independent, because not all of our customers are going to be in an Informix environment, doesn't use the Informix libraries. It uses its own, or it uses actually, a standard C library that's based on, if I remember right, a POSIX standard. So we use standard C library locale functions that are provided typically by the operating system instead of the Informix localized libraries. And then again, one more thing, we have different environment variables than you use with Informix. Your 4GL applications used a client locale environment variable to define the locale, and Genero uses different environment variables, the lang and lc all environment variables. Now you can find more details, of course, about the environment variables and the locale libraries in the documentation, the BDL documentation. Another consideration that you might want to look at when you're going through your, let's say, design phase, or looking at your roadmap on how you get to a Genero GUI-based application from your 4GL application, is Genero does a lot more strict function signature checking. 4GL is not as strict when you're compiling, and by signature checking they're talking about perhaps defining a function, and when you define the function you have it return two values, but then let's say when later on in the application you call that function and have a returning clause that maybe only specifies one value to be returned. That would actually probably compile in 4GL, but in Genero we would actually catch that during the compile, right? It wouldn't be trying to return the proper number of values, or we wouldn't be asking it to return the proper number of values. So you may, in other words, get more errors when you're compiling because of this more strict function signature checking. It might require you to actually do a little cleanup on your legacy application. Licensing considerations. It's always a point when you start thinking about licensing when you're moving to a new product. So with Genero, a license is needed for every server where the software is installed and for every user that can access it. We actually have two types of licenses available. We have user licenses and CPU licenses. A user license gives you a finite pool of available connections, and usually if you want to count up how many user licenses you need, typically it's however many users you have will equal the number of connections that you'll have. So that would be the number of user licenses you'll need. However, depending on how the users use the application or how the application is designed, there may be cases where a single user could consume more than one user license. An example of that might be, let's say the user actually starts up, let's say a user that uses the desktop client starts up more than one instance of the desktop client and brings up the main application screen more than once. Maybe he's got two different things he wants to work on, but he wants to leave those same windows up. Something like that would consume an additional user license. So it's really that base connection that they're talking about, connecting to the server. With a CPU license, you wouldn't really need to worry about that aspect because the CPU license gives you an infinite pool of available resources. It has its own, let's say, caveats for lack of a better word. You do have to match up the number of physical CPUs that you have with the number encrypted in your license. Otherwise, it will reduce the pool to however many CPUs you have, I believe times 100. So there's other things you need to look at when you go with the CPU license, but the idea there is to get around limitations with having a finite pool of connections available. That would be a good discussion with your support or salesperson. Okay, we're switching gears here to more considerations for deployment. Already a few times, I believe, in the session, Francesco has a comment that says CPU license has been changed to core. And you know, that does ring a bell, Francesco. I'll write that down and I'll get back with you. I'm not exactly sure, but for some reason I think that is correct. So I won't have the answer, of course, while our session's going on today, but I'll put that down as a email that I will send out to everyone on the session later to see if the licensing has changed, because I believe you might be correct. But I'll double check. 1 second while I write that down. Okay. All right. So I'll look that up later. All right. Grab my highlighter here. And I believe a few times already this session we've talked a bit about when you get ready to move to the web environment, then the web environment requires a GAS configuration. GAS just stands for the Genero Application Server. So that's short for application server. And the GAS is just the engine that delivers the Genero applications, not a whole lot of complexity to figuring out the terminology. So there's lots of components here to look at. We can go through them, though, pretty quickly, I think, just to give you an idea of what your deployment might look like and how the deployment environment can be a little different from the development environment. So the first component here they're talking about is the user agent, and the user agent in this context is just talking about the browser. So the first thing here would be the end user is using a web browser. He types in a URL to specify what application he wants to access in that browser. And then for deployment, you're going to have a web server component that's responsible for routing that request to the GAS dispatcher. A few minutes ago, we talked about how one of the components of the GAS, the application server, is something called a connector or dispatcher component. And those are included with your application server, your GAS installation. And we do provide different types of these dispatchers or connectors. You can see down here at the bottom of the image. We have different connectors for different types of web servers, which I believe we talk about more on the next slide or so, so I'll kind of leave it at that for now. So the web server routes the request to the appropriate dispatcher based on what kind of web server that you've implemented. The dispatcher, the connector, starts something called a VM proxy, which is what we see here, to handle the request. And again, there's different types of proxies as well based on the type of proxy started. So we have a different type of proxy, for example, for the web client versus the desktop client, and so on. So it might be you might see different types of proxies running. And then the job of the proxy is to initiate or start up the runner, which we call the dynamic virtual machine over here. That's just, we'll call it the runner for short. And that's more or less your kind of a runtime, like a mini operating system for your application, the environment for your application to run in. And then the DVM, the runner, his job also, if necessary, if it's a database application, is to interact with the database. So there's a kind of a simplified view of what the environment looks like for a web client or a deployment. Notice it also says down here at the bottom of the slide, I think we've already emphasized that, but the web server has to be included for deployment or for production. Now this page, or our next few slides I believe, is showing you that during the development process you don't actually have to have a web server in place. GAS, the Genero Application Server, actually provides some built-in, grab my highlighter here, HTTP capabilities to serve up the web page itself. So for development purposes you can use what we sometimes just call standalone GAS. There's a special dispatcher or connector included called HTTP dispatch that you do have to start up manually, or you can script it if you prefer, and you can use that kind of simplified environment for the development process. If you want to test that out using the standalone GAS, talking here about starting up the dispatcher, which you do have to start up manually or script. With Windows, you can actually start it from the Start menu. Find, in this case, we've got Developer Suite, but whatever suite of tools you have for Genero, under the Tools menu option, Genero Application Server, Standalone. And then you should be able to kick off this HTTP dispatch process that way. So with Windows, we actually have a menu option for it. Now on Unix and Linux, of course, you can script it, or you can manually type in HTTP dispatch to start up the standalone GAS process, dispatcher process. And then you'll want to test that to make sure the environment is correct. And one way to test it that most of us kind of agree on is by trying to bring up the demo application that comes with Genero. So here's the URL that you can specify for the test. In this case, it's a local host we're using for development, but that's where you can specify your machine name, the port that the dispatcher is listening on, or that the GAS dispatcher is listening on. That can be changed, but the default is 6394. And then the application, in this case, the demo application that comes with the product. It's a good way just to quickly test to make sure everything's installed correctly. And here they've used that URL, typed it in the browser, and sure enough, the demo application has come up here. And you can verify that at least your standalone GAS configuration is working properly. So everything's installed correctly and the environment is okay. So at that point you can do development, right, without the web server. And when you're ready to deploy, you will need that web server. So again, we have more here about the connectors that are provided with the Genero install. So sometimes they're called connectors, sometimes they're called dispatchers, so you can kind of think of those as the same thing. And the whole role of the dispatcher or connector is to handle the communication between the web server and the GAS. So we just looked at the standalone dispatcher or connector that we use for development purposes. They just refer to that as the standalone connector or dispatcher. We also have a dispatcher for Windows servers using IIS. We have a fast CGI extension for any web server that supports a fast CGI extension. An example might be Apache, for example, for Unix environments or Linux environments. And we also support Java web servers as well. We have a Java dispatcher for any Java server that supports servlets. An example of that might be Tomcat, for example. So a few configuration steps when you're ready to deploy, some of the things you'll need to verify or configure. Grab my highlighter again. Depending on your environment, you may have to add database configuration to the gas configuration file. So here they're talking about the name of the gas configuration file is as.xcf by default. We do provide a default configuration file, and that's its name. Notice the location. There's the gas installation directory, which has its own environment variable, fgl gas dir etc. So that's the location of the default XCF file, the configuration file for the application server. So typically we don't recommend that people get in there and actually modify the default gas configuration file. What people usually do is go in and create a copy of that, and then you can specify the name of the configuration file that you create when you start up the gas. Right? There's a, if I remember right, there's a -F option that you can use to specify the configuration file that you want to use when you start up the application server. So typically we make our own copy and we edit that copy. We don't actually edit the default. And then we can specify any database related environment variables. So here's an example they have here using Informix. So here they've gone in and specified for a particular application. They've got some environment variables here for the Informix database. The old tried and true ones we're all familiar with, Informix dir, Informix server, and LD library path. So that may be a step that will be required. It depends on the database that you're using and whether or not that's handled some other way in the environment. Now another step that's required for registering an application in the GAS is to actually create what they call an external application configuration file. Got a really long name, but essentially it's an additional XCF file. And notice that the location where you actually place that file, they call it a group directory or a group. So in this case, the group, the directory we're placing the file is called app. And that's an actual default group directory that you can use with Genero. You can also configure additional group resources with the GAS by editing that as.xcf file that we talked about on the previous page, or you can just use the default that we have here, this app group. So this is where by default that we would put these external application configuration files. And of course the idea is that file contains all the information, environment settings, and that type of thing that would instruct on how to actually start the application. Now here we're talking about the demo, but in real life it would be the application, your application. So here's I won't go through the entire thing, but you can see it's got a lot of settings here that specify the location, the name of the module, the runner, the runtime version of the application, the path where the application is stored, that type of thing. Now the good news, I'm going to tell you a little bit ahead of time here, is that if you use the Studio development environment, one of the things you'll see is that Studio will actually create this external application config file for you. and then you can just change the name of it and edit it if you need to and use it. So you don't actually have to create these from scratch. You can let Studio do it for you. We'll actually see that here in a moment or two, I believe. The next step would be to verify your gas environment. If you think you have everything installed and configured correctly at this point, you might actually skip over this and see if everything actually gets launched correctly. And then I guess if it doesn't launch correctly, you can come back and check your environment and see maybe where things went awry. But in an ideal world, this is what we'd do next. We'd check our gas environment. It actually gets a lot of the settings and environment variables from different places, and this is specifying, this slide is showing us the list of environment variables that get set and in the order that they're applied. So the first place that the gas gets environment variables and setting is from the dispatcher, right? The dispatcher that starts the proxy. The next place it gets some of the environment variables is from the application configuration in that external configuration file that we looked at on the previous slide. And then finally, the actual HTTP request in the URL that the user specifies also creates some settings, path, for example, that are used to access the application. So there's all the different places that the gas environment gets its settings from and the order that they're applied. Again, the dispatcher has to be running before you can launch an application through the gas. Most of the dispatchers or connectors that we talked about are automatically started by the web server when they're needed, but remember the standalone gas we did say has to be started manually. So typically the web server will start those automatically, but in some cases, especially with standalone, if you haven't scripted it, then you'll need to start up the dispatcher manually. In any case, it needs to be running. And then you're ready to try out your application using the web client. So here we are trying to launch an application from a web browser, and the default web client is Ajax. So they're suggesting you just bring it up with the default web client and see if it actually launches. Now here's an example using Studio. I mentioned a minute ago that if you'll use Studio to launch your application, you can specify down here at the bottom of your Studio interface, you can actually specify whether or not you want to use the desktop client, which is the default, or a web client using one of several different themes that we have support for. So the default theme right now is Ajax. So if you specify the web client like we see here at the bottom of the screenshot, then you're going to be rendering your application with Ajax. So this one looks like it came up fine. So this tells us that everything is installed correctly, the dispatcher is configured correctly, the gas configuration file is fine. The external application configuration file is configured okay. So we have a successful application launch. Now when you use Studio, there's additional what they call themes that you can select from this drop-down list here in the Studio screen. There's a theme for Microsoft Silverlight that you might want to try out, and HTML5 as well. So there's the way to test your configuration, is just to launch your application using the web client. Pick a theme, for example, in Studio that you want to use, and if everything launches successfully, then you're in good shape. Now, one thing you'll want to do is, depending on the theme you've selected, there might be some limitations on your theme, and there are some theme-specific pages in the GAS documentation that you might want to look at just to see if there's any specific gotchas or limitations for Silverlight or HTML5 or Ajax, whatever theme you're using. Now in real life, of course, we don't go into Studio and select a theme. Typically, the theme is selected based on the browser that the user is using. So this is just for development and testing purposes that we're selecting it in Studio. Here's the same thing, only from the command line, or not from the command line, but from a web browser. Right, so instead of using Studio and doing the testing that way, you can just bring up the browser, and then in the browser specify the URL to access or launch your application. Now here's the URL example for standalone gas, right, using the HTTP dispatch process. We're using localhost with the port, the default port, and the name of the application that we want to launch. And here's an example using a web server, right, a deployed application with the web server. To specify a different theme, notice that you just change up your URL a bit and add this output map section and specify the output map. So here's an example of specifying an output map of Silverlight, and here's an output map for HTML5, or specifying the output map of HTML5. I'm going to go back for just a second because there was something I wanted to show you in that previous slide and I forgot to do it. So let me pop back over here for just a moment, grab my highlighter. A few minutes ago I mentioned that if you will use Studio for your development, it will actually create that external application configuration file, that big mouthful. It'll create that for you. So right here I wanted to show you, here we are rendering this application now using the web client. And notice this is using the standalone dispatcher. So prior to actually launching this application, something we had to do to get this screenshot was to actually start up the HTTP dispatcher, right? So that had to be started. In this case, we started it manually, and then we specified in Studio that we wanted to run the application as a web client application using the default AJAX scheme. And it created the special external application configuration file. And notice I can just go look at that, change the name on it. Notice it's added my user ID information as an extension to the file name. I can just change the name back to just the plain application name, edit the file if I want to edit it in any way, and then I'm ready to go. So I don't actually have to create those from scratch. And of course, once you have one just like you like it, you can essentially just copy and change them from that point on. All right, so that's it as far as going through a lot of the migration considerations and deployment considerations. We do have one more slide here that talks about where you can find more information about migration. We've got some really good example migration scenarios using the stores demo database that all of us from an Informix environment have been familiar with. So that's something that's familiar to you that helps make it, I think, a little more easy to make the leap from TUI to GUI is by using the stores demo. We're all familiar with that. So we actually have some examples, step-by-step examples using that. We also have videos to go along with the examples that we have in kind of white paper form. I'll show you those in a minute. We also have a migration guide where most of the information for today's session came from. So you'll see a lot more suggestions and considerations in the actual migration manual. So the stores demo goes through a lot of the same things that we talked about here in our session today. It shows you how you can very quickly just recompile and run applications if you want to more or less not do a lot of enhancement, but just leave them pretty much as they are. You can recompile and run with minimal changes in TUI mode. Enhance them, perhaps taking advantage of the traditional GUI mode. You might look at enhancing a bit there. And then fully taking advantage of Genero. They've even got some good examples of showing some things you might do to take advantage of Genero features, styles, and whatnot. So let me give you a look at those real quick, and then I'll let you go for today. So here is our 4Js website. If you just go to www.4js.com, if you go to the download area under documentation, we'll start there. Here's our 240 release documentation. It's our most recent. So I'll go right down here to Genero BDL with Web Services, and we'll select this 240 BDL User Guide. So when that comes up, over here on the far right of the screen is a section here on upgrading, and specifically what we're interested in today is the i4GL Migration Guide. So a lot of good information in the 4GL Migration Guide. So you can see a lot of the topics we discussed today are here. Using C extensions, localization support, what else? User interface topics, traditional mode. So a lot of things we discussed today, you can find more information here. Something else I want to show you is right here under Company, under the Company tab, we have IBM i4GL to Genero. So if you click on that, you'll find the stores demo example where you can actually see the step-by-step instructions on just kind of a gradual migration of the stores demo to GUI mode. They even show you some of the enhancements, right? Enhance the stores demo with Genero features to give you a head start on how to do some of those things. We also have that in our videos as well. Take just a second to see. There we go. So if you prefer a video format, you can watch the videos. All right, so let me check real quickly here and see if I have any outstanding questions. I know I have the question on CPU license and whether that's changed. So I will have to get that to you in an email, perhaps later today. Let me check, see if I have any other questions. Ed says, is GAS also required for the ActiveX Windows desktop client? Actually, GDC can also be used with the GAS and implemented with the GAS, and in that case, yes, you can actually do direct connections with HTTP or use the GAS with the Genero desktop client. All right. Okay. Very nice. We have a good group today. Thank you very much for attending the session today. I haven't forgotten that I do have one question that I need to email everyone the answers to, so I'll try to get that to you later this afternoon if I can get an answer that quick. Otherwise, it may be a day or so. So thank you very much for attending. Our next session, of course, is in 2 weeks, and that session will be about reports. So I believe it's the very last Training Tuesday session, at least for this series, until we decide sometime to do them again. So thanks very much for attending, and I'll hopefully see you again in 2 weeks.